Let's get into one of the big topics of this course, Redux. Now, for many people, Redux is this big and kind of scary thing that seems impossible to learn. For you, however, it's the opposite, because you already know how the use reducer hook works. And therefore, learning Redux is actually gonna be quite straightforward and a lot of fun. So, to make it really easy, we're gonna start at the very fundamentals by learning Redux in isolation. Then we'll integrate Redux into this small application and also convert our Redux code to the more modern Redux Toolkit. And we're even gonna make API requests right inside Redux using Thunks. And this is actually one of my favorite sections of the entire course. And so I can't wait to show you Redux now. As always, let's start by getting a good understanding of what Redux actually is and how the mechanics of Redux work, especially when compared with the use reducer hook. So, in a nutshell, Redux is a third-party library that we can use to manage global state in a web application. And I say web application because Redux is actually a complete standalone library that we could use with any framework or even vanilla JavaScript. However, Redux has always been tightly linked to React, and they are actually quite easy to connect using the React Redux library, as we will do throughout this section. Now, the big idea behind Redux is that all the global state in your application can be stored inside this one globally accessible store, which we can then update using actions. And if this sounds familiar, it's because the use reducer hook implements a very similar pattern. So, updating state by dispatching actions. Remember? And in fact, the mechanism behind Redux and use reducer is so similar that I will assume that you know how to use reducer and build the teaching of Redux onto the knowledge that you already have. So again, you should have a pretty good understanding of the use reducer hook in order to move on in this section. And if you don't, then please go back to that use reducer section first. But anyway, the idea of updating state in React and in Redux is always the same. So in the case of Redux, as soon as we update the store, all the React components that consume some data from the store will be re-rendered. So conceptually, if we think about this, Redux is actually quite similar to combining the context API with the use reducer hook, as we have done in the WorldWise app. And in fact, many developers even say that the context API is a replacement for Redux. However, the truth is a bit more nuanced than that, as we will discuss by the end of the section once you have some experience with both of these tools. Now, Redux has a long history, and so today there are basically two versions of Redux, so two different ways of writing Redux applications, but which are totally compatible with each other. So we have the classic Redux and we have the more modern way of writing Redux with Redux Toolkit. And as you would expect, we will learn both of them in this section, starting with classic Redux so that you get the right foundations. Okay, now before we move on to learn how Redux works, let's quickly check out when we should actually use Redux. And let's start with some history. So, historically, a few years back, Redux was used in almost every React app out there for all global state management needs. So, you really needed to know Redux. It was as if Redux was even part of React. Today, however, the landscape has changed tremendously, because there are now many alternatives, as we have already talked about in the Advanced State Management lecture in a previous section. So today many apps don't actually need Redux anymore and also don't use Redux anymore. And this means that you might not even need to learn Redux right now. So why is it included in this course then? Well, for three big reasons. First, since Redux has a reputation for being very hard to learn, this was probably the most requested topic for this course by my current students. And I think that this course does teach it pretty well in an easy to understand way. Second, when you're working on a team, you will likely work with an older code base, and then you will definitely encounter Redux. Therefore, you need to learn how it works, even if you don't master it. And third, some applications do actually require something like Redux. And so let's take a look at when that is by bringing back this overview from a previous lecture. So my recommendation, and the recommendation of many experts, is to use a global state management library like Redux only when you have lots of global UI state that you need to update frequently. And remember that UI state basically means state that is not fetched from a server. That would be remote state. So UI state is simply data about the UI itself, or data that doesn't need to be communicated to an API or so. And this distinction is really important because remember, for global remote state, we have many better options nowadays, like React Query, SWR, or even a tool that is kind of included in modern Redux Toolkit, which is Redux Toolkit Query. So again, do you need to manage a lot of non-remote state in your app? Then Redux might be perfect for that. But the truth is that most global state is actually remote, which is the reason why so many apps don't use Redux anymore. But we are actually here to learn Redux, at least if you still think that it's worthwhile. And I personally think that it is. And so let's now quickly look at the mechanics of how Redux works. So, as I said in the very beginning, this won't be too hard for you because you already know how useReducer works. And so let's just quickly review that. So with useReducer, when we want to update state from an event handler in a component, we start by creating an action. This action is simply an object that usually contains a type and a payload, which is information about how the state should be updated. We then dispatch that action to a so-called reducer function. The reducer takes the action type and the payload and, together with the current state, calculates the next state, so the new state value. And to finish, as the state updates, of course, the component that originated the state transition will re-render. So this mechanism should be familiar to you at this point, because now we're going to add two more things onto this in order to learn how Redux works. So the first difference between useReducer and Redux is that in Redux, we actually dispatch actions not simply to the reducer, but to the store that we talked about at the beginning. So this store is a centralized container where all global state lives. It's like the single source of truth of all global state across the entire application. The store is also where one or multiple reducers live. And just as a reminder, each reducer must be a pure function that has the single task of calculating the next state based on the action that was dispatched to the store and the current state that's already in the store as well. Now, you might be wondering why there are multiple reducers in this store. Well, it's because we should create one reducer per application feature or per data domain in order to keep things separated. For example, in a shopping app, you could have one reducer for the shopping cart, one for some user data, and one for the application color theme, for example. Finally, any component that consumes the state that has been updated in the store will, as always, get re-rendered by React, at least if we're assuming that we're using Redux together with a React app. Okay, so that's the Redux store, but now let's focus on the action again. So in the real world, when we use Redux, we usually use functions called action creators in order to automate the process of writing actions. So basically, instead of always writing these action objects by hand, we create functions that do this automatically. This has the advantage to keep all actions in one central place, which reduces bugs, because developers don't have to remember the exact action type strings. Just note that this is optional and not a feature of Redux. It's just how we build real-world Redux apps. Then the rest of the process is of course just what I explained before. Okay, so let's recap how this Redux cycle works, as I like to call it. So in order to update global state with Redux, we start by calling an action creator in a component and then dispatch the action that resulted from the action creator. This action will then reach the store where the write reducer will pick it up and update the state according to the instructions. This then triggers a re-render of the UI where the cycle finishes. And the big goal of all this is to make the state update logic separate from the rest of the application. And now just for fun, we can take it back to the bank analogy when we first talked about use reducer. So remember how we said that when you need to take or to place money into a bank account, you don't do that yourself directly, but instead you go to the person at the desk in the bank in order to give them your instructions. So you don't update the bank vault yourself. And Redux is just like that as well. So taking the example of depositing $50, you would definitely be the action creator, as you are the one giving the instructions. The instructions themselves are the action, and the person that you're talking to is very clearly the dispatcher, because he is the one who will instruct the bank vault to be updated. So the bank's vault is like the Redux store that you can touch directly, but only through the dispatcher. And there you have it. This is how Redux works. Do you still think that it's super hard and super confusing? Well, maybe you do, and that's 100% not a problem. So I will guide you step by step through the Redux fundamentals throughout this section, and by the end of it all, I promise that it will be crystal clear. So let's now start learning Redux in isolation, so without React first, by writing a simple reducer function. Now, even though we are going to start with Redux in isolation, we are still going to start by creating a new React application now, so that we have some place where we can actually write our Redux code. So let's again come to the terminal and navigate to the folder that we're interested in here. And then, since we are still learning, we can again use create React app. So that's absolutely no problem. And let's use again version 5. And here I'm just gonna call this Redux intro. All right. So give it a few minutes until this is installed, and then let's meet back here. Okay. So let's open up, as always, our starter files. And so I'm going to grab these and then place them right here. And as always, renaming it and placing that right here. And then we need to replace these files that already exist. And let's also immediately get rid of this junk So these 3 files we don't need, and also this CSS file right here. So we only need the index.css file that I provided for you, and also this test file. Okay, then let's take this and open it up. Okay, and now all we are going to do for now is in this source folder create a new file called store.js. And so this is where we are going to write our pure Redux code. So basically Redux without React, so that we can really understand Redux in isolation first. And later, of course, we will then integrate the two. So what we're going to do in this section is to model the bank account that we have already talked about earlier, but again, a bit simpler. So without an account number and only with a balance, a loan, and also a loan purpose. And actually, let's start with that. So just like with useReducer, we start by creating some initial state object. So initial state, and then let's set the balance to 0, also the loan amount to 0. And then here I'm also going to introduce a third, basically state variable, which I'm going to call the loan purpose. So whenever the user asks for a loan, they also need to specify the purpose of that loan. Okay, and now again, just like with the useReducer hook, it's time to define the reducer function. So we can just call this reducer for now, and as always, it receives the state and the action. And so remember that the goal of the reducer is to calculate the new state based on the current state and on the received action. Now, it's also important to remember that reducers are not allowed to modify the existing state, and they are also not allowed to do any asynchronous logic or other side effects. So instead, what we should do with reducers is to place as much logic as possible inside of them. Okay, but anyway, one thing that is actually different between this reducer and the reducer in the useReducer hook is that usually we directly pass in the initial state as the default state. So using here this default parameter in JavaScript. So this is just a normal JavaScript feature where you can specify a default parameter in case there is none set. So with this, we make this initial state here really the state at the very beginning. And so then let's again use a switch statement to basically select the action.type. So the actions that are going to be dispatched to this reducer, or actually to the Redux store, they will again have the shape of a type and a payload. And so basically our reducer will look exactly the same way as we are used to already. And so that's why it is now so easy to learn Redux when you already know useReducer. So here we now need to specify our actions as always. And so let's do that. Now, back in the day, action types used to be written all uppercase, for example, like this, like set balance, or maybe deposit account. So if you check out some older Redux codebase, then usually you will see that the action type is called something like this. So many times it's a setter and all uppercase like this. However, nowadays the Redux team advises to write these action names in a different way. So usually these action names should model what happened or what should happen. And so we write them in the shape of the state domain. So that's the account in this case, and then the event name. So let's start with deposit here. And I think we already touched on this earlier in the WorldWise application as well. But anyway, now we need to, again, as always, return the current state. So spreading all the current state into this new state that will be returned from here. And then we want to set the balance to the current balance. So that's at state.balance plus the actions type load or payload. So action.payload, which remember is basically the data that gets passed into the reducer when the action is dispatched. And again, it's very important that you understand everything that we did earlier with the use reducer hook, because this is exactly the same thing. Okay, then let's just duplicate this here for the withdrawal. Or actually, let's just call this withdraw. And so here it is then minus that. Here let's also add already our default case. But here we do it a bit different. So before we would usually throw some new error right here, right? However, in Redux, or for some reason, it is advised to not do that, and instead to simply return the original state. So basically, in case that the reducer receives an action that it doesn't know about, it will simply return the original state back. So the state will simply not be updated, but there also won't be an error. Okay, next up, again, account. So all of these are about accounts, and so all our action names in this reducer will start with the account prefix. But later we will have another reducer which will then have another state domain name. So here the next one is for request a loan, which can only happen if there is no loan yet. So if state.loan is greater than 0, then just return the current state. But if not, well, then return the current state, and let's update then the loan. So that will be the action.payload. And actually it should be action.payload.purpose. So like this. However, we haven't really dispatched the action yet, and so this is going to look a little bit confusing. So I think that maybe we should actually leave this for a little bit later. So this entire part right here. So we will only write this part here of the reducer later. So basically in the next lecture. But now we can also do the last one, which is to pay the loan back. Because this one is a lot simpler. So what's going to happen here is that the loan will be set back to 0. The loan purpose will be set back to the empty string. And of course, we need to then take that value out of the balance. So state.balance minus the loan. Okay, and if this is a bit confusing, so the way in which we are modeling this bank account, it will become more clear once we start using this reducer soon. All right, so with this, we have our reducer in place, and so now we can create our store. And so let's do that in the next lecture. Now it's time to create that Redux store that we talked about in the beginning. So now we will use an actual Redux feature for the very first time. So what we did here was simply writing an object and a function. So we didn't really use Redux yet, but now we need it. And so now we need to install it. So let's come to our terminal here, and then let's do npm install Redux. So just like this. And so out of this Redux package, we will now take the create store method. So in order to create that store. So let's import that here. Create store from Redux. And so now you see that it has like this strike through here. And the reason for that is that the Redux team kind of declared that this method is deprecated. So as I mentioned earlier, there is now a more modern way of writing Redux, which is Redux Toolkit. However, I still believe that it is really way better to first learn Redux in this way. So in the way that I'm showing you now. And then once you have all the Redux knowledge, to then transition into Redux Toolkit. Because otherwise, everything will really just seem like magic. It works just too easily, and then you have no idea what is going on. And so that's why they also tell us down here that, well, where is that? Yeah, so you should not be using the Redux core package by itself, except for learning purposes. And so that is exactly what we are doing here. So we're just learning how Redux works. And so for this is more than enough. And don't worry, because this will never be removed from Redux, as it says right here. All right, but with that warning out of the way, let's now actually create our store. So all we have to do is to call the create store function with the reducer. So that's really it, at least for now. And so then this will return the store. And so let's just call it store. So just like this. And so now on this store, we can dispatch actions. So for example, we can do store.dispatch, which is going to work in exactly the same way as the dispatch function that we got as a result of calling the useReducer hook. So again, this dispatch function is basically what we already know from useReducer. And so this is where we can now pass in that event. So let's specify account deposit and then a payload of, let's say, 500. All right. But now how do we actually run this code? So how can we execute this and then see the results? Well, let's just open up our index.js file, which is the file that we already know will always be executed at the very beginning. So at first, let's just clean this up. And now what we're going to do, again, just for learning purposes, is to simply import that entire store.js file. So just like this, actually. And so what this will do is to simply run the code that is here in this file. So we're not exporting anything from here and not importing it here. But all we're doing is to importing this file, which will then simply run the code that is here in the top level of this file. So if I console.log anything from here, it will then appear in our console. So again, this is just a way of executing our test or learning code here. Okay, and now, as always, we should be able to run npm start. So let's wait for that. And yes, agreeing to open in another port. And then, as always, this takes some time. And here we go. So this will be the application that we're going to be working on later. So it's basically like the graphical user interface to the account that we're modeling here. But for now, I'm only interested here in the console. So let's make this even bigger so we can really see what's going on. And so, indeed, we got our console.log coming from here. But that's not really what we're interested in. Instead, we want to now console.log store.get state, because that will then show us the current state of our store. And nice. So our balance is already 500, which is because we dispatched that action right here. And so now we have Redux already working in this very simple way. So let's try another one. Let's say account withdraw and then 200. And so then we need to log again, because what we log here is only after that very first action. And so now that went down from 500 to 300. Now we could also subscribe to the store, which would then automatically show us these updates here on the screen. But let's keep it simple, because in the real application, we will later not need that. And so there's no need to learn an additional thing here. But anyway, let's get maybe rid of this one just to clean the code a little bit. And so now I want to dispatch the action of actually requesting a loan. So request, or first account request loan. And then remember how I said that the payload here will actually a bit more complicated. So that's why we left this part here for later. So now for the very first time, as a payload, we will actually pass in another object. So we haven't done that before, but of course this is perfectly fine, because with this we can then pass in basically multiple pieces of data. So let's say that we want an amount of 1,000 euros, and then the purpose is to buy a car. And apparently a very cheap car, but let's just roll with this example. And so now here in this action, let's use that data. So here the loan is account.payload.amount, and the purpose, or actually I think it's called loan purpose, is action.payload.purpose. Let's see. Yeah. And so let's see what our store looks like after this operation. And indeed, we get our loan, we get our purpose, but we also have to now add that loan to our balance. Because of course, after we get the loan, then our balance goes up by that amount. And so let's also set a new balance, which is going to be the current balance. So state.balance plus the action.payload.amount. And there we go. So that's correct. And now finally, just to experiment with this last one as well, let's then pay the loan back. So just to see that this event here actually has no payload at all. So pay loan. And so after that, we are basically back to before. So the balance went down again. And here we are back to the beginning as well. So this actually works great, but let's add some more Redux conventions on top of this. So remember how I mentioned in the first lecture of this section that usually in Redux, we don't always manually write the type like this, but instead we create something called an action creator to automate this process. And so let's create those action creators in the next video. So, as I just said, now it's time to build our action creator functions. So basically, action creators are nothing more than simply functions that return actions. So they are really not a Redux thing, and Redux would work perfectly fine without them, but they are a useful convention that Redux developers have used forever, basically. So Redux would work without action creators, but since it's a convention, let's now create some. So basically, we are going to create one action creator for each possible action. So let's call one deposit. Let's duplicate this. One is withdraw. One is request loan. And the other one is pay loan. All right. So again, these functions, all they do is to return actions. And an action is basically just this object. So let's copy this one, then return it. But of course, we now need to customize this value here. And so this is going to be the input of this function. So let's call this the amount. And then here, we replace that with the amount. So let's comment out all of this right here so that we can basically recreate the same thing, but with our new action creators. So the way it works now is that we still, of course, call store.dispatch like this, but in here, instead of writing the event, we just call the deposit function with our amount. And then store.getState is what we want to log to the console. And yeah, we have the exact same result as before. Okay, and so let's now copy this here. And here it is now with draw. And it also needs an amount. Try this one as well. Maybe 200 again. And nice. So I think that this actually looks a lot nicer, and it is especially a lot more reusable than always writing the object here by hand. So that might create a problem that we write something wrong here. So maybe a typo, or maybe we don't remember the right string. And so then that can introduce bugs. All right. Now, of course, you could create the same convention, so this exact same pattern, also with useReducer. So that would be pretty easy to do, right? So here again, let's copy what we had before. And then here we need to specify the amount and the purpose when we call this action creator. So here we can simply erase this. And so let's do that. So request loan. And again, we're going to request 1,000 to buy a cheap car. And then let's log it again to the console. Nice. And now just one more. So return. And this one, of course, doesn't even need any input, because here all we need to do is to create this object with the type of account pay loan. So store.dispatch and then pay loan. And let's see. And nothing happened. So we get exactly the same state as before. And I see, so here we have a typo. So this is exactly the kind of typo that I mentioned earlier that can always happen. And so now it is correct. Okay, and that's all there is to know about building action creator functions. Now, back in the day, React developers also used to place these strings here into separate variables into a separate file. So for example, we could have one variable called account deposit, which would then contain this string right here. And then we place that right there. And also here. And so then we would also have the action name string here in one central place without having to manually write it twice. So that is also something that you will see in older code bases. And so that's why it's important that you are aware that this exists. However, in more modern React, that is no longer being used. And so we will just go back to the way that we had earlier. But again, if you work with an older code base and you see something like this, then you already know what that means. Okay, and with this, we finish this part, and next we will add some more state here. Moving on, let's now create some more action creators and a reducer about the customer state. And this time, let's actually start with the initial state and with the action creators, so that we actually know what we later have to write in our reducer. So let's come up here and do that close. So let's call this one initial state customer. And then let's also rename this one to initial state account. And of course, then the same thing right here. All right, so our customer should have a full name, which starts empty, a national ID number, also starting empty, of course, and a created at property, also starting empty. All right. And then let's create our action creators. And later on, we will of course separate this all into different files because it's already getting a bit out of hand. But never mind for now. So the first action creator, let's call it create customer. And for this, we will probably have to pass in the customer's full name and the national ID. So the time of creation, we don't need to pass in because we can simply create that logic in here. So as we build the action. So as always, let's return the action and here the type. Again, let's start with the domain. So earlier we had account / something. And so now let's do customer /. And for the sake of convention, let's actually name this event here exactly the same thing as the action creator function. So basically here, I will now place exactly the same thing as here. So this is also what we did here. So the deposit function creates the account / deposit, withdraw, and here the same thing. Okay. And now here the payload will again be a bit more complex. So we will pass in the full name, the national ID, which we both received here, and then also let's pass in the created at. Now we could also do this inside the reducer, so computing the current date, but that would actually be a side effect. And so we shouldn't have side effects in the reducer function. And so let's do that here. Now, usually we should in fact keep as much business logic as possible inside the reducer. But again, since this is actually a side effect, this does not belong in the reducer. Okay, so here we simply return the current date, nicely formatted, and that's actually it. So let's create another one for updating the name. So update name. And so here, let's again pass in the full name and then return the type of account / update name. And here the payload only, so payload, all it needs is the full name. All right. And so now we know the two events that can happen and the shape of the data. And so based on that, we can now easily create our reducer function. So first of all, let's rename this one here to account reducer. And then of course, we need to update that here. And yeah, so down here, let's then create the customer reducer. So again, this takes in the state, and as a default, we want the initial state customer, and then also the dispatched action. So here, switching over the type as always. So customer, and then it was, I believe, create customer. And here we need that colon at the end. And so here, let's return the current state, and then let's update everything. So the full name will become the action dot payload dot full name. The national ID will become also action dot payload dot national ID, and the same thing for created at. All right. And here we are again destructuring the current state, even though we are then overriding all the three properties that are in there. So the reason for that is again that this way we will not run into any problem if, for example, later we add another property like a status or something like that. All right. Let's add our default as well, which will be to just return the state. And then we also have customer slash update name. And so here the only thing that's going to change is that the full name will become action.payload. All right. And now we need to use this reducer somehow. So we also need to place that reducer inside our store. So remember how we learned earlier that in Redux, we don't dispatch actions directly to the reducer, but really to the store. So that's exactly what we did right here. So store.dispatch. And that's going to stay the same now as we have a new reducer and basically some more state. Now we cannot simply pass that other reducer in here. But instead, what we need to do is to combine all the reducers that we have in order to create one so-called root reducer. Because this reducer that createStore here receives is always considered the root reducer. So right now that's just this one. But again, usually what we always do is to combine all the reducers that we have. So let's say that our root reducer is. So now we need to take in another function from Redux. So this one right here, make sure it is imported. And then here we specify an object, and then we need to give each of the reducers a meaningful name. So the one that makes sense for the account is just account. And so for this one, we specify account reducer. And then let's say for the customer, we of course use the customer reducer. And then here we use that root reducer and watch what's going to happen then here in the output. So see that? We see that now we have both the account and the customer in our state. And so these are the names that we gave right here. So if we call them A and B, then that is the state that would appear here. So basically that's the name of our state, really. So then if we open this up, inside the account is exactly the data that we had before. And in the customer is still our initial state because we didn't dispatch any actions yet. So let's do that and actually use these to action creators that we created in the beginning. So store dispatch, and then using our action creator, create a customer. And so here let's pass in the full name. You of course should use your own one. So first the full name and then the national ID. And here, let's say it's some combinations of numbers like this. And then let's see what we have. So let's see if this actually works. So store.get state. And yeah. And it was created here at this moment in time. And of course, I could also use this one, but there's also no need to. And of course, all the other ones are still working. So I can still, for example, call our deposit function and deposit 250 in there. And let's do that here. And so then previously my balance was 300 and then that got increased. And so Redux is smart enough to know that, for example, this action right here belongs to the customer reducer, while these other ones, this one, for example, belongs to the account. All right. And that has nothing to do with the fact that we specified those here in the strings. So this is really just a convention that we followed, but we could give it any name that we wanted. So Redux is really not looking at these strings. That's only for us developers so that we understand what we're actually doing. But React only uses this information that we give it here. And so then internally it figures out that, for example, this type here is for the account and these other ones are for the customers. Now, of course, all of this doesn't make a lot of, let's say, real world sense. So customers and accounts should, of course, somehow be connected, for example, by some account number or so. But that doesn't really matter here, because here we only want to really understand how Redux works. And I think that we are doing a pretty good job with that so far. Now, next up, it's then time to finally organize this mess that we have here into a bit of a more professional structure. Let's now organize our code into a more modern and more professional file structure while using the concept of state slices. So our code here is getting a bit out of hand. So we have all these action creators and the reducers and the initial state all in one file for all of these different state domains. So for the account and for the customer. And so imagine we had 10 reducers instead of just 2. So this is not practical at all, and this is not how we do it. Now, a few years ago, so basically at the beginning of Redux, developers would usually create one reducers folder and then create one file per reducer. And the same with the action creators. So they would create one actions folder and then one file for each action creator. So you will definitely see that if you look at some older Redux codebase. However, this leads to a lot of jumping around in the codebase. So jumping between different files, which is really not useful once you're writing your code. And so this is no longer the recommended approach. Instead, we are now going to organize our application into features. And in our case, the features are pretty obvious. So we have the account and the customer, right? And we will then also organize our components into these same feature folders. For example, here we have the balance of the account, and so that's going to be part of the account. So this here is an account feature, and the same here for these operations on the account. While creating a new customer and displaying the customer name are definitely features of the customer. So it's a customer feature, and therefore let's now do that. So this is a completely new way of organizing code, and we will explore this a lot deeper as we start writing our next big projects. So those ones we will also organize into features. So instead of having like a component folder, we will just create, as I have been saying, the features folder. And then in there, we create one folder for each feature. So account, and I should write it correctly. So account like this, and let's do another one. So customers, so we should call them the plural name. And so let's give ourselves a bit more space. So the account operations component sounds like it's part of this one right here, and then we get an error. So let's actually update the imports here. And so, yeah, so right here, now inside this app.js, then this path here will no longer be correct. And so in case that your VS Code did not automatically update the import, you need to do that on your own. But anyway, the balance display is also part of the accounts. So again, the path to the file updated automatically. And then create customer is here part of the customer's feature, and the same thing for the customer. All right, so all 4 components are now in their right place, and the file path have been updated. Okay, but now back to Redux, where it is now time to also create a file for each feature here in this folder about Redux. So let's call this one an account slice. So a slice is basically a piece, so just a part of the total state. So the entire state lives in the store. And so here we then basically take one slice of that state. And so this one here is going to be everything related to the account. And then we will also have one customer slice. And so now the idea is that in each slice, we co-locate as much as the Redux logic as possible in one file, so that we don't have to jump around all the time between files, which is really annoying, trust me. So usually here we place the reducer, the action creators, and the initial state. And we then export those and put them back together here in the store. So let's do that. And actually, let's first create a copy so that you can basically keep this initial version for yourself. All right. So let's take this initial state of the account, cut it, and again, a bit more space. And actually, this is not the one that I wanted to edit, but this one. Okay. Now the account reducer. So let's cut that as well. And of course, now the application will really stop working here. But that's not a problem. So we are basically just refactoring here. And now let's also grab all the 4 action creators. Okay. And then we will get rid of all this code that we had, which basically simply tested all those action creators. And the same with these. And now everything else, except this part here, should be about the customer. So let's place that in here. And let's grab the initial state, reducer, and action creator of the customer. All right. Nice. And so, as I said initially, now we basically need to get them back here. So at least the reducers. So what this means is that we need to now export the reducers from here. And usually what we like to do is a default export of the reducer function like this. So we export this one as a default, and then we also export all of these, but as named exports. So basically just placing the export keyword right there. All right. And now all we have to do is to import this reducer back into the store. Now, these action creators, we will now no longer import them into the store because that's not where we need them. So later on, we will dispatch these actions inside our React components. And so that's where we will then use these action creators. So we will later import them in our React application. Now, before we place them back in the store, let's also export everything from here. And then, well, here it's only these two. So export, and then just like this, we are actually finished with these two slices. So we have now these two slices of the state and are ready to import them back here. So import account reducer from the features folder, then accounts and account slice. And then the same, of course, for the customer reducer from features, customers, and customer slice. And of course, if we had some more data domains, for example, if we had some state about the employees of the bank, then for that, we would create another slice of the state. So in that slice, we would then again have the initial state, the reducer, and the action creators. And so we would then combine that one as well with these two. So then we create our store again, and then in the end, all we have to do is to export that. So let's do again an export default of this store so that we can then in the next lecture finally get this store into our application. All right. So let's now actually go to index.js where we import the store file already, but now let's actually import the store from. So now we no longer just want to run this file, but we also want to get this store back. All right. And so now on that store, we can just like before dispatch some actions. So let's try that. .dispatch. And now instead of the action creators, I will just again write one manually. So let's say the type is deposit, or I think that's account/deposit. And then the payload, let's do 250. And then let's console log store.get state. Give it a save. And let's see. Nice. So our Redux store still works in exactly the same way as before, but now it is really in this nice, modern, and professional file structure. So again, what we did, we basically divided our store into these multiple slices. And so a slice basically corresponds to the initial state, the reducer, and the action creators. And notice how this file really is only functions and this object. So we are not even using Redux here. The only file in which we're going to use Redux is right here, so that we can combine our reducers and then create a store. And so then in the end, we export that store so that we can then import it here. And in the next lecture, we will then actually inject that store basically into our React application, and therefore finally connecting the two. So now it's time to finally connect our Redux store with the React application. And so to do that, we need to bring in another package. And so that is React Redux package. And so only through this package is how Redux and React applications can actually talk to each other. So let's wait for this to install. And now, once that's done, let's actually provide our store to the application. And so this actually works in a very similar way as the context API. So let me show you. What we need to import now from the React Redux package is the provider. So just like this. And now we can wrap our entire application in that provider. So again, just like we do with the context API. So we use the provider component, place the application in there, and now here we need to pass the store prop. So a prop called store, and as you can guess, this is where we pass in our Redux store. So that is also called store. So this one right here. And with this, we have then successfully connected the two. So that's it. So now our application knows about the Redux store. And so now our application knows about the Redux store, which means that every single component in the application can now read data from the store and can dispatch actions to it. So that is once again very similar to the behavior that we see in the context API. So it's basically broadcasting global state into every component that actually wants to read it. So let's start then by reading the state. So let's come here to the customer component. So this is our simplest one. And so let's start with this one. So in order to read data from the Redux store, all we have to do is to use the useSelector hook that is provided by React Redux. So useSelector, and there we immediately see it as it has been imported from React Redux. So again, this package is necessary so that these two technologies can talk to each other. Now, this useSelector hook takes a callback function, and this function takes as the single argument the entire Redux store. So we usually call that store, and then from that store, we can simply get the data that we want. So let's say store.customer. And so these names right here, so the .customer is exactly the name that we provided here. And so that's also the name that we saw earlier here in our console.logs when we were checking out the entire state. So if we change this here, for example, to A, then here that would also be called store.a. Okay, and then we can just store that into any variable that we want. So let's see. And yeah, there it is. Now it is, of course, still empty because that is the default state and we didn't add any customer yet. But we can still already see that this is working. Now let's actually just get the customer's name here from the store, and we should really do as much data manipulation, so to say, here in this selector function. So if we want to get only the full name, then we should write that in here, so in this function. And inside this function, we can also do all other kinds of computations. And we will see an example of that in the next big application that we're going to build. For now, I will just grab the full name here, and then let's display the customer right here, which again will be empty here. So welcome no one, basically. But yeah, we'll fix that in a minute. So for now, what I want you to understand is that this useSelector basically creates a subscription to the store. And so just like we are already used to, whenever the store changes, then this component that is subscribed to that store will re-render. Now behind the scenes, Redux also implements some performance optimizations which are probably similar to the ones that we talked about earlier in the context API. But what matters is that the mechanism here is similar to the one that we already know about. So the state in the store changes, and so the component re-renders. Okay, and so next up, it is actually time to create our first customer. And so in the next video, we will learn how to dispatch actions to the store. Let's now learn how to dispatch actions to the Redux store from within React components. So still within our customers feature, let's now open up the create customers component. So here, if you want to take a minute to analyze the code, feel free to do that, but this one is actually pretty simple. So all it is these two input fields, which are already controlled elements with these two use state hooks right here. And so all we're going to do is to complete this handle click function, which is called when the user clicks right here. So here on create new customer. So let's actually make this small again and place them side by side. And here actually we don't need all of this, and even the window is bigger than it has to be. All right, but anyway, it is in this function where we will want to dispatch now an action that will create the new customer. So how do we do that? So before, when we wanted to dispatch an action, we called the dispatch method on the Redux store. Remember that? However, that's not how we do it inside React. Instead, we get access to the dispatch function by using the use dispatch hook. So use dispatch, which is a custom hook that was provided to us by the React Redux package once again. Okay, and so all this will do is to return the dispatch function to us. And so this dispatch function then of course works in exactly the same way as before. And so now we can use that right here. So to dispatch an action in this event handler. But what action should that be and how should we do that? Well, this is where our action creators come into play again. So let's open up here our customer slice and notice how here we again have the create customer and the update name action creator function. And so all we have to do is to now import this one into our component. So probably if we start typing create customer, then React will automatically import that for us. Well, actually it didn't, but that's not a problem because that's easy enough anyway. So here, remember that is a named export, and so we need these curly braces. So create customer from customer slice. And so remember that all we need here is the customer's name and the national ID. And we already have these. So they're already in our state. And so we just pass them in here and the national ID. And probably here, before we even dispatch, we should check if the values actually exist. So if there is no full name or if there is no national ID, then just return. So then just do nothing. But otherwise, we dispatch the action that will be created by this action creator. So let's test that. And first, if we click here like this, then nothing happens. But now let's test that and click here. And beautiful. So that worked nice. So now my name got immediately here into the user interface. And so what I mentioned before did indeed happen. So here we are reading that value from the store. And so as soon as that value updated in the store, so basically in this global state, then this component has re-rendered. Now here we could now clean the input fields, but instead let's actually hide the form, because once the customer has been created, there's no need to display that form anymore. So let's close this one. Let's close our slice. And then this one we also no longer need. And so let's come to app.js. So where all these 4 components are included. And so now, again, if there is no customer, then we only want to display this one and otherwise these 3. So that means that we need again to get the information, so to get the current state from the store in this component. So that's easy enough. We already know how that works. So we use selector, which receives this callback function, and then here we say state.customer.full name. So let's store this in, well, let's call it full name this time. Give it a save. And now here we just need some conditional rendering. So let's say if full name is equal the empty string, then we want to render create customer. But otherwise, we want to render these 3. So we need to create a new fragment, close this, and I think that this should work now. And yeah, so actually that form is gone, but let's try from the beginning. So now only the new customer form is displayed, but not the name of the customer and the balance and the operations. Yeah, beautiful. So our application is, well, almost looking like a real bank application. Well, not really, but that's not the point in this application right here. We're only working how to work with React and Redux together. And now next up, to keep practicing how to dispatch actions, let's also work on this form right here. So on these account operations. So that's right here. And here we do have a lot more code already. So basically the entire code of all these input fields here and all that is all in this one big component. So in the real world, we would probably split this into multiple, but here, as always, I wanted to keep it very simple. But you should maybe now pause the video here and for like 5 minutes, take a look at this code here and how it works. So basically exactly what we're doing here. Okay, but anyway, what this does is basically to implement a graphical interface for all the operations that we can do with the account. So we can deposit, we can withdraw, request a loan, and then pay it back, right? So for example, let's say we want to deposit 500, and that then actually is reflected here in this button. So see how that is the same there. And then once I click here, of course, I want to deposit this value. And so that should then show up right here in the balance. So this component here shows us the current balance in our account. So we already have the 4 event handler functions, which is where we are going to dispatch our actions. So each of them is linked to each of these 4 buttons. So let's start with the first one. And the first thing that we need to do is to get access to our dispatch function. And so again, for that, we use the use dispatch hook and store the resulting function into the dispatch variable, which of course we could name anything that we want, but this is the name that we are already used to. So first of all, if there is no deposit amount, then nothing should happen. So just a normal guard clause right here. And so now it is time to dispatch our action. And once again, our action is going to come from the action creator. So in this case, that is called deposit. So coming from the account slice. So this one right here. And so all this one needs is the amount, and then it will automatically return this object right here, which is then going to be dispatched into our store. And so then the reducer receives that, updates the store, and then re-renders our components. So just like we already know. So here, what we want to deposit is the deposit amount. All right. And then in the end, let's set the deposit amount back to the initial state. Now we cannot really test this yet because this balance component is not implemented yet, and so we cannot see then the result of depositing. But we will actually need the account state here in this component as well, so to display right here the current loan. And so let's then also import, so let's read basically from the store the current balance. So actually, let's get the entire account, and then we use selector. So import that from React Redux, and then with the entire state, we want to read state.account. And we could also get access, of course, to the entire state object. So all we had to do would be to leave this like this. All right, and then here for now, let's just log the account to the console. So here it is. And it is at 0 right now. But now if we deposit 100, then that worked. So our balance is now 100. So we successfully dispatched our deposit action to our reducer. So everything worked in exactly the same that I just explained earlier. And so now all we have to do is to basically repeat the same thing here 3 times. And so if you want, you can pause the video right now here and do that as a challenge. So, did you do that? And if not, that's no problem at all. But here it's basically exactly the same as before. So if there is no withdrawal amount, then just return. And otherwise, we want to dispatch the withdraw function, which again comes from our account slice. And by the way, here is also this currency field, which we're going to use a little bit later. So that's why I haven't talked about that one yet. So here we use the withdrawal amount and then set withdrawal amount back to empty. So we are at 100 now. So let's withdraw 50. And nice. So it got reduced to 100 minus 50, which is again 50. All right. Next up, we have the loan, which is slightly more complex. So for this one, we then need the loan amount and the loan purpose, which are the 2 arguments, I think at least, that the request loan function requires. So first, let's check if they exist. Loan amount or no loan purpose, then just return. But otherwise, dispatch request loan with these 2. And actually VS Code is smart enough to understand, so to read this function from the other file and tell us that we need the amount and the purpose. So that's very helpful. And that's because actually behind the scenes, VS Code is running TypeScript. So analyzing all our file structure with TypeScript. And finally, of course, also the loan purpose. And then in the end, let's set them both back to empty. All right, time to test this. Let's say we want 1000. And here buy a car. So let's clean this request a loan, and yeah, it works again. And now here we want to actually display that loan. So that's why I said earlier that we actually need to read the account data from the state. So here actually, by convention, this should be called store, not state. And so here actually, let's now destructure the account. So instead of having multiple selectors, we will just select the account and then the structure. So we get the loan, and let's recall that to current loan. So not recall, but rename. And we get the loan purpose, which here we really need to rename because the state variable has that same name. Okay, and we also want the balance so that we can display that down here. Okay. And yeah, so right here is where we want to display that loan. So that's the current loan. And then inside parentheses, let's place the current loan purpose. And so then we get our $1,000 to buy a car. So we still have our loan. And so now all we have to do is to pay that back. So here it's the simplest one. It's just pay loan without any arguments. And then as we click, all of this goes away and our balance goes back to 50. And all of this here should actually only be visible if there is a loan in the first place. So current loan greater than 0. And so now that disappeared. So if we ask for a loan again, then that appears and we can pay the loan back. Nice. So great work so far, and I hope you are really getting the hang of it. So working with Redux together with React. So it's a bit of a different mindset, but again, if you already know use reducer, then this shouldn't be too bad. But anyway, the only piece that is still missing here is now this balance. But let's leave that, of course, for the next video, as this one is already running pretty long. In this lecture, I want to show you the old way, so before React hooks existed, of connecting React components to the Redux store. So let's open up the balance display component, which is the one we still have to work on. So the use selector and use dispatch hooks that we have used up until this point are the modern way of using Redux in React. So before hooks existed, we had to use the connect API. And you will still see this API in older code bases. And so since I want to teach you all of Redux, so both the modern and the old way, let's use this old connect API in this component. And I can immediately tell you that it's a lot worse. So basically, the way we usually used that API was simply with the connect function right here. So besides exporting those hooks that we have been using, the React Redux library also exports that connect function. And so this connect function takes in another function, which then in turn will return a new function, which will then accept our component as a new argument. So that sounds really messy, but what matters is that this is what it looks like. And that function that I just mentioned is usually called map state to props. And what this does is exactly what the name says. So basically, this function here receives the state object from the store. And then here, all we have to do is to return an object in which we can define the name of a prop that our component should receive. So that sounds confusing, so I will just do it. So let's say we call it balance. And then the value of this balance should be state.account.balance. So we could also take the entire state or just the account, but all we want is really this balance. And so now we pass that function here into connect. All right. And so what's going to happen then is that this function here will return a new function. And so this here will then become a function, and the balance display component will then be the argument of that new function. And so that new function is basically a new component. And that new component will have the balance prop. So just like this. So we defined it as balance here, and so then that's the name of the prop. And so therefore map state to props. So that's the name of the function right here. And so what it does is to map some state from our store to a prop. So a prop in this component. And so now we can use that balance right here to display it. And we pass it then first into this format currency function that I already had provided here. And so we get our $50. Now, for some reason, sometimes this connection doesn't work in the beginning. And so if that's the case for you, so if your balance is not showing up there, then just close the application. So cancel it in the terminal and then restart it again. And so that should fix it. All right. Now, of course, it's not really important to understand how this works because you will not use this on your own. This is just so that when you see this in the wild, at least that you know what this does. So again, before we had hooks, this is the way we needed to do it because there was no other way of getting the state somehow into the component. And so now if we deposit something here, then that updates right there. Okay, and this is actually all. Now in the next lecture, we will take the complexity up a notch by talking about Redux middleware and Thunks, which we can use for asynchronous operations like data fetching. So that's going to be pretty exciting. And so let's now move on. Let's now take a look at how we can extend the functionality of Redux by using something called middleware. So let's say that we wanted to make an asynchronous call to some API. So where could we actually do that in Redux? Well, we can definitely not make the API call inside a reducer, because reducers need to be pure functions with no side effects. So by itself, a Redux store doesn't know anything about performing asynchronous logic like this. It only knows how to synchronously dispatch actions and update the state. Therefore, any asynchronous operations like that API call need to happen outside a reducer. So instead, should we maybe fetch the data inside the component and then dispatch an action to the store with that received data? Well, that is actually possible, but it's not an ideal solution. And the reason for that is that we usually want to keep our components clean and free of data fetching. And we also want our important data fetching logic encapsulated somewhere, so all in one place, and not have it spread all over the application. Therefore, fetching data inside components, like we have been doing all this time, is not ideal. But if not in the store and not in the components, then where do we perform asynchronous actions? Well, that's where middleware comes into action. So in Redux, middleware is basically a function that sits between the dispatching and the store. This means that a middleware allows developers to run some code after dispatching an action, but before that action reaches the reducer in the store. So again, usually after we dispatch, the action immediately reaches the reducer and the state is updated. But with a middleware, we can do something with the action before that action actually gets into the reducer. And therefore, this is the perfect place for our asynchronous API call, as well as other operations, such as setting timers, logging to the console, or even pausing and canceling the action altogether. So, in essence, middleware is the go-to place for side effects in the Redux cycle. Okay, so now that we know what middleware is, where does middleware actually come from? Well, we can write middleware functions ourselves, but usually we just use some third-party package. And in the case of asynchronous operations, the most popular middleware in Redux is called Redux Thunk. So let's see how thunks work by analyzing what happens to this action that we have seen before. So now that we have this thunk middleware in place, the action will no longer be immediately dispatched, but will first get into the middleware, so into the thunk in this case. Then we can start fetching some data inside the thunk, but it could also be some other asynchronous operation. But let's stick to data fetching here. Now, as soon as the data arrives, we place it into the action's payload, and then we finally dispatch the action into the store, where the state will then immediately get updated. So basically, the thunk allows Redux to wait before dispatching the fetched data into the store. Or in other words, we have used the thunk in order to defer dispatching into the future, so to the point in which the data that we need has actually arrived. Alright, but this is of course a lot easier to understand in practice, and so let's implement this in our application now. Let's now use Redux Thunks to implement the feature where the user can deposit money into the account in a foreign currency, which will then be converted by calling an external API. So basically, whenever the user deposits some money here, they can select which currency that money is. So for example, euro. And so if that currency is different from US dollar, then we need to convert these 500 euros back to US dollars before they actually get deposited into the account. So before that deposit action is actually dispatched to the store. And so that's where now the Redux Thunk comes into play. So we will have that middleware sitting between dispatching the action as we click here on the button and that action actually reaching the store. Okay? So in order to use this middleware, we need to follow 3 steps. First, we install the middleware package. Then we apply that middleware to our store, and finally we use the middleware in our action creator functions. So let's now do them one by one. So down here, let's say npm install redux-thunk. Okay, and so then we can import the thunk function basically from Redux Thunk that we just installed. Not think, of course. And here, okay. So we installed and brought that thunk in, and so now we need to apply that to our store. So here in the create store function, we can pass in another argument. And now here we need to call the apply middleware function. So apply middleware, which is also provided by Redux itself. So see how that got imported here. And now into this apply middleware function, we pass in our middleware. And so that is the thunk. And so with this, we basically told Redux, or we told our store, that we want to use the thunk middleware in our application. And so let's now go to the action creator that is actually responsible for depositing money in the account. Now here we lost our account. So there we go. But as I was saying, now let's come into the account slice, and in particular here into this deposit action creator. So here, besides accepting the amount, we now also will need to accept the currency. So as we dispatch the action of deposit, we will not only pass in the amount, but also the currency. And so let's actually immediately do that. So right here, so handle deposit, this is where we dispatch this action. So where we call this action creator. And so here now we also need the currency. And then let's also clear the currency since we're already here. And so that's it for now. So again, now our action creator receives not only the amount that should be deposited, but also the currency that that amount is in. Now, first of all, if that currency is already US dollars, so if that's USD, and these values, they come right here from these option values. So we have USD, for US dollars, we have Euro, and we have British pounds. So these can be the three currencies. So again, if the currency already is US dollars, then there's nothing to convert. And so then we can simply return the object, so this action, just like before. So in this case, nothing is going to change. But if the currency is different, then this is where we will need to make that API call. And so for that, we need the thunk. Now, this middleware is in our code actually nothing special. So the only thing that changes is that here in this action creator, we will not return the action immediately, but instead return a function. So we can now return a function like this. And so then here, when we dispatch right here and then call the deposit action creator, instead of ending up with the event object right here, we will end up with a function. So basically, we will dispatch a function. And so when Redux sees that, it will know that that function is the thunk. And so it will then execute that function and not immediately dispatch the action to the store. All right. So again, if we return a function here, then Redux knows that this is the asynchronous action that we want to execute before dispatching anything to the store. Now, in order to then later actually dispatch, this function here that Redux will call internally will get access to the dispatch function and to the current state. So by calling the get state function. All right. And so then here we can do our API call. And then once we are finished with that, we can then finally in the end return the action. So this is where we will return the action in the end. All right. And so let's do that API call here. And we already used this API before. So let's just grab the URL here from the Frankfurter, and here it already is. So like this. And then you can just click here on documentation. And then all the way in the end, we have this URL right here from which we are going to fetch. So just copy that. And then here, let's do the fetch request. And now here we don't have the host. So let's just grab this part here as well. And place that here. All right. Now here we of course now need to replace these values. So the amount is the amount that we actually get. So amount, and then from is this currency that we receive, and the to currency is US dollars. Now, of course, we could also have defined the target currency in the state, for example. So we could create also here the currency that the account is in. And so then here we would have to check that. But let's once again just keep it simple here. All right. No, not sure why I have two fetches here. But anyway, we'll want to await this and then store the result into the res variable. And so then we make this an async function. Okay. Then as always, we need to await the conversion to JSON. And then let's take a look at the data first. And so this should, at this point, already be working. So let's test this. This is not really important here. And so let's deposit 100. And let's say that we are depositing 100 euros. So let's click here. And so indeed, our function here was now called and it logged to the console these results. So we are interested in here is these rates and then .usd. So let's just store that as well. So converted is data.rates.usd. All right. And so now we have the value that we actually want to dispatch to the store. And so now we will return our action. So basically exactly what we had here before. So the action type is the same and the payload will now no longer be the amount, but the converted amount. And so with this, we did now in fact delay the creation of the action to the future. So basically to the point after this fetch request here has successfully retrieved the data. So only after all of this is done, we actually dispatch. So actually it is not return here, but really dispatch. So here we no longer need to return, but really to dispatch. And so that is the reason why we get access to the dispatch function right here. And so now we basically have two dispatches. So first we dispatch here, and in the case we have another currency that is not US dollars, then this will return a function, right? So this function right here. And so then Redux will call this function and pass it the dispatch function so that we can then call that function in the future when we want to actually dispatch our action in the end to the store. So when we already have the result of the asynchronous operation. And so this should now actually work nicely. So let's then deposit 100 euros. And beautiful. This is exactly what 100 euros converted to US dollars is right now. And of course, you will see a different value here, but what matters is that this worked now. And so if we think about this, then this entire code here, what is essentially our middleware, really sits between the dispatching and the store. So when we dispatch the action and the currency is different from US dollar, then that action never actually reaches the store, at least not in the beginning, because instead, then this code here will be executed, and only after that is finished, we then dispatch a new action to our store with the new value. And so again, this really sits then in the middle. And so therefore the name middleware. And now just to finish, let's also show the user some loading indicator. So telling them that some asynchronous operation is happening. So to do that, let's create a new state here. And as always, let's call that isLoading, which in the beginning will of course be false. But then as soon as we start fetching, let's then actually dispatch an action that will set isLoading to true. So basically right before here. So we can do dispatch, and then the type of the event, let's call it account, and then converting currency. And so you see that we really can dispatch actions as we please right here in this middleware. So we don't have to limit ourselves to only doing that here in the end. So here we will dispatch immediately to let the user know that we are doing some work. And then in the end, as soon as we're done with that work, we dispatch the new value into the store. So then it reaches our reducer. And so now let's then implement that new action right here. So that's account/converting currency, I believe. And so here all this does is to return the current state and set is loading to true. Okay, and so now in the end, do you think that in the end we should then here dispatch another action, so one to basically set is loading back to false? Well, we don't have to, because that's the beauty of updating multiple states at the same time with the reducer. So all we have to do is to come here into deposit and then set the is loading to false right here. And so now all we have to do is to then get that from the state. So from here is loading, and then we can use that right here close to the button. So here we can use the disabled prop and set that to is loading. And so then whenever this is true, we will not be able to click on that button. And then here inside the text, let's do some conditional rendering. So let's say if is loading, then let's say converting, and else, then here we need a template literal, just like this. So let's check again with our 100 euros. And that was really fast, but I think the text changed here shortly. So let's come to our network tab and do some throttling with a slow 3G maybe. And then let's try that again. So I always like to do that. Well, that's still very fast. So I guess that API is a fast one. But yeah, let's just trust that everything works this way. Okay. Now the beauty of what we just implemented here is that this component here actually has no idea that the amount is converted behind the scenes. So that conversion is completely hidden from our component, and instead it is encapsulated right here in the account slice. So it's happening here in the centralized place. And if we had other API calls or other asynchronous operations in these other action creators, then of course they would also be in this file. So again, they would then all be in this one centralized place, not spread all over the application. And so with this, we can keep this component here really tidy and clean. I mean, it's not really that clean because we chose to have all this JSX in one file, which usually we would probably split up. But you get the point. So we don't have the data fetching anymore here in the component. So I hope this wasn't all too confusing. And what I mostly want you to retain is that when we are using Thunks, we, instead of returning an action object from the action creator function, we return a new function. And so then the result of this becomes a function and no longer an object. And so then Redux, when it sees that we are dispatching a function, it will call that function. And into that function, it will pass in the dispatch function and get state, which we didn't even use in this case. And so then we can use that dispatch function inside here to delay that dispatching until the asynchronous operation that we want to implement has finished. And so therefore, we can think of this function here sitting between the initial dispatching and the reducer in the store receiving the action. So I believe I mentioned in the beginning of the section that Redux comes with amazing developer tools just like React. And so let's now install and use those dev tools. And just like with middleware, installing the Redux DevTools is a 3-step process. So first, we need to install the Google Chrome extension. So let's do that immediately. So Redux DevTools. And so then it is this first Google Chrome extension. So I already have that installed, but please go ahead and install this one now. So again, just like the React DevTools. Then next up, we actually need to also install the corresponding npm package. And so that one is called npm install Redux DevTools extension. So let's wait for it. That should be pretty fast. And there we go. And so now this npm package gives us one function that we need to use. So let's bring in compose with DevTools. So exactly this one. And so now this is going to look a little bit weird because what we need to do is to wrap this apply middleware in the compose with DevTools. Give it a save. And with this, we should be good to go. So again, it doesn't really matter why this is the way we have to write it, but well, this is it. And so now here, you should get a new tab for Redux. And in case it doesn't show up for you, then just make sure to restart your browser. So let's click there, and here are our DevTools. So let's make our window bigger and this whole thing a bit smaller. And then let's explore this. So what we need to do here to test this is to dispatch some actions. So let's do that. And there we go. So here we now see our first action that was dispatched. So with the name of customer/create customer. And so then here we can see the action object. So again, with the type and the payload, and then the state that resulted from dispatching this action. All right, and if we keep going here, let's say we deposit $200. And so then again, we see the new state that has been created after this action has been dispatched. And we can see the action itself as well. And let's try that again, but this time converting from US dollar, or actually from euro to US dollar, and then what happened down here. So now we do indeed get our two actions dispatched. So first, the converting currency action. So this one right here, which will set our state here in the account to loading, right? And then this next one here, where we then, after that value has arrived, finally deposit. So as loading is then back to false, and then we see our new balance right here. And so the action that was dispatched this time was 109. Okay, let's try another one so that afterwards I can show you the coolest feature of these dev tools. So basically what we can do is to now jump around between these different state transitions. So for example, we can say that we want to jump back to this place right here. And so then you see that our balance is back to 200 because at this point we only had deposited once and we had deposited only 200. You can also say that we want to jump here. And so then at this point, notice how the state is still completely empty. So we have no balance yet. And so yeah, this was basically the very initial state. And even cooler than that is that we can even use the slider down here to move through these state transitions like this. And so what as the balance there updates. So here in the very beginning, we don't even have a customer yet. So that's when we then input our name and ID. So then we came here, then we deposited for the first time, then we deposited again, which then triggered this conversion. So here, then the state was at loading true. Then afterwards, we got this new balance. And then in the end, we got down to 59 because of this last withdrawal. Okay, so I think that you can see how this can be really, really useful if you have a lot of different state transitions and a really complex state. So then you can basically time travel between these different transitions in order to maybe find some bug or some problem that you have. We can also actually manually dispatch some actions here. And I think that we have one that is named account/update name. I'm not sure of this, but let's try. Payload. Let's say test, and then let's dispatch. And well, that didn't really do anything. So let's check out our code. So here in the customer slice, well, it's actually called account name. So maybe there's some typo there, but not really. Well, for some reason that doesn't work, but it's also not really important. So let's just close this here. So you see that our state didn't really change as a consequence of this, which is now leaving me really intrigued. Let me check out again. Something must be wrong. Okay, I see. So here we have the correct name, which is customer/update name, but for some reason then here we have a bug. So here it should also be customer update name. So now everything reset. So let's try again with the initial data. Let's just deposit something here, and then let me dispatch that action. So customer, and then the payload of test. Let's dispatch, and yeah, so now it actually updated the name right here. So again, this can be quite helpful if you just want to manually dispatch some actions without having to wire up like some buttons in the user interface. And now let me just find a bug here. So let's try to deposit again. And so now this will actually create a problem. So notice that when I clicked here, it actually dispatched the action of account converting currency. So that's strange, right? So let's see what happened there. So where is this action here actually dispatched? Well, it is dispatched, of course, right here in the account slice right here. However, this should only run if the currency is not US dollar. But here in the user interface, it clearly was. So this means that we have some problem. So let's come to that component. And here we actually already can see the problem. So here, after we dispatch, so after we deposit for the first time, we then reset the currency back to this empty string, while the initial state is actually USD. So then the second time we try to convert, it is not the USD currency that gets into the action creator, but an empty string. And so this tool just helped us here a little bit with finding this problem. Now here we need to reload to get rid of this initial error. Then let's try $100, and then let's just try that again. And so now it is fixed. Great. So I think with this, you got the gist of how this DevTool extension here works. So if you want, you can play around a little bit more with this and do your own experiments. And then once you're done with that, let's move on to the more modern Redux with Redux Toolkit. So now that we understand the fundamentals of Redux, it's time to take the next step and learn about the modern way of writing Redux, which is Redux Toolkit. So, as I just said, Redux Toolkit is the modern way of writing Redux code, and it's advised by the Redux team to now prefer Redux Toolkit over classic Redux. That's because Redux Toolkit is an opinionated approach that forces everyone to use best practices that the community has learned over the years. So basically, Redux Toolkit took all these best practices and placed them into this new way of writing Redux. Now, does this mean that everything that you just learned is obsolete? Well, not at all. First, without these fundamentals, it's very hard to understand Redux Toolkit, because it is built on top of classic Redux, of course. And second, both ways of writing Redux are 100% compatible with each other. So you can actually use classic Redux in one part of the app and Redux Toolkit in another part, if that's what you want to do. Okay, so that all sounds great, but what's the big deal? So what are the actual advantages of Redux Toolkit? Well, the biggest advantage is certainly that Redux Toolkit allows us to write a lot less code to achieve the exact same result as before. So we say that we need a lot less boilerplate code, which is basically code that only sets things up but doesn't really do anything meaningful. And so Redux Toolkit hides all that stuff, like setting up middleware and the developer tools. So out of the box, Redux Toolkit gives us many things, but the three highlights are: first, it allows us to write code that actually mutates state inside reducers. Now, behind the scenes, a library called immer will convert our code back to non-mutating, so like the one that we have been writing up until this point, but the new code that we're going to write will look as if we were mutating the state object directly. And in my opinion, this is really the biggest advantage of using Redux Toolkit, because if you have a pretty complex state object with nested objects and arrays, this can actually be a game changer in reducing complexity. Redux Toolkit also automatically creates action creators from our reducers, and this can be quite helpful as, again, it helps us writing less code. It can, however, also create some additional work in some situations, as we will experience in practice soon. And finally, Redux Toolkit will also automatically set up Thunk middleware and the developer tools, so that we can focus on writing code that actually does something in the application. All right, and this should be enough of an introduction, and so let's head back to code. Let's now start using Redux Toolkit by converting our store to this new modern way of writing Redux. And remember how I said that Redux Toolkit is 100% compatible with the regular Redux, which means that we can do this upgrade in a very gradual way. So we can start by only converting the store, but leaving our slices as they are. So that's really nice again. So let's now start by, as always, installing this new tool by writing npm install, and now it is this @ symbol, so @ redux.js, and then Toolkit. So this looks a bit different from what we're used to, but this is just because this @redux.js is basically a namespace in which the creator of this namespace then can publish multiple packages. All right, so let's wait for that to install. And there it is. And so remember how earlier we saw that this create store here is deprecated. And so now indeed we will use the configure store method instead. So let's import configure store right here from this package that we just installed. So this configure store function basically wraps around create store and adds a few functionalities to it. So basically configure store does a lot of things automatically for us. So it automatically will combine our reducers, it will automatically add the Thunk middleware, and it will even automatically set up the developer tools. So basically this part right here. So all of this will happen automatically, and then in the end, of course, our store is created and returned. Now let's actually first duplicate this file here so that you can once again also keep basically the original older version. So here let's remove that again. And then inside our actual store.js, we now can get rid of all of this stuff. So we don't need any of this. And instead, all we need is this configure store. And then we can also delete all of this, because all we need now is to call configure store, and then we pass it an object of options. And so here we can then specify the root reducer, basically. So simply the reducer property, and then again an object where we tell Redux Toolkit about our two reducers. So let's again call it account, which is account reducer, and then also again customer. So customer reducer. And this is actually it. So the result of this will be our store. So then down there we export that. And so now our application is working in exactly the same way as before. And so again, that's because we can upgrade gradually to Redux Toolkit. So see how extremely easy it now is to set up a Redux application. All we have to do is to call configure store and pass it our two reducers. That's it. Nothing else we have to do. Now, then the part where we connect the React application with Redux works in the exact same way as before. So nothing changes with the React Redux package that we use on the React side. All right. So this simplification of setting up the store is already a huge win. But React Toolkit can also help us with writing the state slices themselves. So here in the customer slice, we can now basically write this entire logic in a different way. And so let's see how in the next video. Let's now convert the account state slice into Redux Toolkit. So let's close the customer slice and actually open up the account slice. Now, remember how we had already organized all our code here into this concept of slices. So we have the initial state, we have the reducer, and we also have the action creators down there in this file. And so now with Redux Toolkit, this idea of slices actually really got baked into Redux itself. So we now have this function called create slice, which we can import from Redux Toolkit. So let's do that. So import create slice, just like this. And so this create slice function here gives us three big benefits. First of all, it will automatically create action creators from our reducers. Second, it makes writing these reducers a lot easier because we no longer need that switch statement, and also the default case is automatically handled. And third, we can actually mutate now our state inside reducers. So just as we have learned about previously when we first talked about Redux Toolkit. Now, remember how behind the scenes this will then use a library called immer, which will actually convert our logic back to immutable logic. So behind the scenes, Redux still requires this kind of logic right here, where we do not mutate the state, but we will now be able to convert this kind of logic here to a mutating logic. And from my experience, this last point is actually the biggest advantage of using Redux Toolkit over what we have been doing before. About these other points, I believe that React Toolkit actually forces us into a pattern that's a bit too opinionated, in my opinion. But, well, that's just the recommended way of using and learning Redux right now. And so, as I said in the beginning, let's now convert all of this. Now, actually, let's call this here again, just initial state. Okay. So this object we will actually keep, but the rest, let's now comment it out. And now here we get these errors, but that's no problem. Let's actually make this bigger now and then split the window so that we can see our old reducer here while we are working on the new ones. So this is pretty helpful for converting. Now in the future, you will then, of course, if you choose to use Redux Toolkit, write this without converting. So you will not first write it this way and then converting it to Redux Toolkit. So you will just do what we do right now. And so that is to call our create slice function, which then accepts again an object of options. And so this will then in the end return a slice, which we can call in this case the account slice. So what do we need to pass in here? Well, first of all, the name of the slice, which is account. Then next up, the initial state. So it's a property called initial state, where we then need to pass in initial state. And so since in our case, this has the same name, that's the same as writing this. And then finally, we need to pass in our reducers. So this time we will have basically multiple reducers, one reducer for each of these actions here. Okay, and so let's start writing on those. So the first one is called deposit, and it is a function that again receives the current state and the action. And notice how this deposit is basically the second part of the string that we had right here. So the name is account and then slash deposit, which is this one. And it is, so this deposit is also exactly the name of the action creator that we had here before, right? But anyway, let's now write our logic here. And for now, we will do it without the asynchronous data. So without the thunk that we had before. So what do we then do in the deposit? Well, all we do is to change the state. And so now, remember, we can write mutating logic. So we can do state.balance should become state.balance plus the action.payload. So the logic of receiving the current state and the action that was dispatched is still exactly the same way as in classic Redux. All right, so the only difference is that here we do no longer return the entire state now, and also we don't write it like this. So we don't create a new object where we then set the balance property. Instead, we basically mutate the balance property that lives on the state. And that's actually it for now, because remember, we will leave that here for later, so for the next lecture. So let's keep going with draw. Again, state and then the action. And now here we will have something very similar. So state.balance, and we could even write it like this. So this is the same as state.balance minus action.payload. The same, let's do the same here. So plus equal like this. Next up, let's do the loan, state and action, and not withdraw, but request loan. So let's see what logic we had here. So that's why I'm keeping this file open on the right side. And so here we need again to check whether the loan already exists. So if state.loan is equal 0, then we don't want to do anything. Now in this case, not doing anything is not returning the state, but instead simply returning from this function. So we will not return anything, because remember, in these new reducers, we no longer need to return the entire state. So we just modify what we want. And so in this case, we don't want to modify anything. So this is indeed a huge shift. And if you were already used to writing it this way, because you practiced the use reducer hook, then this is going to be an even bigger shift. But for total beginners, I believe that this is actually a lot easier. And this will become even more apparent when we have like nested objects and arrays. But in the other case, so in case that there is no loan yet, then we can set the loan, or well, actually state.loan to action.payload.amount. So just like before. And let's actually copy what we have here. There's no need of typing it all again. So here it is actually an equal, because remember, we are now assigning. So we are really overriding. So here we need then state dot, and the same thing here. And we can have no commas, because this is not an object. And the same here. And finally, let's add our last one. So pay loan, again, state and action. Then state.loan will become 0. The state.loan purpose will become empty, and the state.balance will become, let's actually do minus equal again. So basically subtracting the state.loan from state.balance. So this is, of course, just a normal JavaScript feature that you already know. All right, and now let's see what we actually have here. So what the result of creating this slice is. Because this is actually already it. So this basically functions as our reducer and as our action creators. So let's now log this to the console. So count slice, then let's close this, and let's make this a bit smaller again. So coming here to our console, let's reload. And then even though we have those errors here, since we are importing this file, then this code here is executed. So let's see what we got here. So we have, first of all, our reducer here, so which is this function that we will have to export from here and then import in the store. So this is basically our new reducer that the store needs. And then here we have this other stuff that we don't really need. But then notice how we have these actions. And so these actions are exactly the 4 action creators that we also had before. So it's these 4 ones that we created here. And so let's now export all of the stuff that we need. So export. And here let's again use export default for the reducer. So just like we had previously here, only that this time it is account slice dot reducer. And now let's then also export these 4 functions here. So once again, just like before. So these are going to be our named exports. And first of all, we need to take them out of that object. So let's write account slice dot actions, which is then this object of these 4 right here. And so here we can destructure that and then immediately export them. So deposit, withdraw, request loan, and pay loan. Give it a save, and it seems like we are back to working here. Let's just reload once again. This has something to do with the DevTools, which keeps happening, but just reloading it a few times usually fixes that. Well, not this time, apparently. So let me close this and restart. And there we go. So that's a bit annoying, but sometimes that happens. All right, so this part here about the customer is still using the old Redux logic, but this here is already the new one. Now, actually, we need to temporarily also update our code in these account operations, because now we don't want to pass in the currency, at least not while we are testing it. So let's duplicate this and just remove the currency from here, just to test this for now. So let's deposit, and yeah, that works. Nice. Withdrawing should work as well. There we go. Let's request a loan, and there we have a problem. So let's use our Redux DevTools. So why not? Well, this is a bit too small now, apparently. Let's make these DevTools smaller again. And so let's see what we have here in our request loan action. And by the way, notice here how the action names are exactly the same ones as before. So basically what this means is that our create slice function combines this name with the names of the reducers. And so that's also why here we used this convention first. So this is, again, the modern way of writing action names. And so Redux Toolkit follows exactly that as well. So it composes these action names with the name and with each of the reducer names as well. But anyway, let's see why we get that problem here. And here it is. So again, we are now using the DevTools really to understand some problems. And so notice how the payload is now only 10,000, which was the requested loan, but the loan purpose is nowhere to be found. And so that's why requesting this loan didn't work. And so let's now inspect this a little bit further. And so what I want to do now is to log to the console now, calling the request loan function, and then with the same values or something similar. And so this is now simply an action creator. All this will do is to return an action object. Right? And indeed, here it is. And also indeed, we see that we only get the first value here, but not the second one. And the reason for this is that by default, these automatically created action creators only accept one single argument. And so that then becomes action.payload. That's why earlier we also got this not a number here, because we were then trying to add this payload.amount to the loan, which didn't exist. So the amount and the purpose were actually not received. All right, and so this is basically one of the limitations of having this opinionated structure. So if these action creators are automatically created, then we cannot really configure them. So we cannot easily make them receive 2 arguments. However, luckily for us, there is a solution for this that Redux Toolkit implemented for us. So basically what we have to do is to prepare the data before it reaches the reducer. And so what we have to do now here is to separate this. So here we now need a new object. So let's open that there and then close that right here. And then we need to call this function here just the reducer. And then before that, we need to prepare that data with a prepare method. And so this method is where we can then accept the data that we want. So basically, this can have the parameters that earlier we had in our action creator. So that's the amount and the purpose. All right. Now here we need a comma, I guess. And yeah. And so what we need to do here now is to return a new object, which will then become the payload object in the reducer. So that's why this is called prepare. So let me just write the code and then it will make sense. So again, here we return a new payload, basically. And so this payload should become an object with amount and purpose. And so it is this object that we return from here, which again will then be the payload in the reducer. All right. And so this is what we need to do if we want our action creator to receive more than just one argument. Now, of course, we could also have configured it in a way that we directly pass in that object, well, not here, but here. So again, we could have made it in a way that we pass the data as an object right here immediately. And so then we would also have only one argument. But if you do want these two arguments, then this is the way to go. And since I wanted to show you this, we just did it this way. And also this way, we then didn't have to change anything in our code right here. So otherwise, then we would have to come back to our React code and change that here. And of course, this preparation can also include some other steps. So for example, later on in that other slice, we will then also add the created add property where we set the date. So also what we did earlier in the action creator. But anyway, this should now be back to working. So let's check that. And there we go. And then paying it works just the same way. Or actually it doesn't. Let's see. So now we get 3,000. And so after paying, it should go back. So what's wrong here? And I can see the problem already. So here we run into one of the pitfalls that comes with the fact that we are now mutating our state. So it has advantages, but it also has its problems. So notice how here in the very beginning, we set the loan to 0. And so then here in this next line of code, this is already 0. And so then we simply subtract 0 from the balance, which will not change it. And so this now needs to come first. So we now need to pay attention to the order of the code. So let's try that again. All right, now pay it back, and beautiful. Now that works, and so we successfully converted now the slice that we had before to this one that fits with the new philosophy of Redux Toolkit. Now, if you want my personal opinion, I do actually prefer, in a simple situation like this, to write what we had earlier. So I like this one more. I think it's a bit more clear what's actually happening, and it's not like a bit of black magic as it seems like here. But that's just what happens when you trade your do whatever you want approach for an opinionated approach like Redux Toolkit. Right? What I do like a lot is, of course, this way that we now configure the store. So this is perfect and it's a lot easier. But as you saw, we can, if we want, keep our slices in the way that we had them before. So without using Redux Toolkit. But there's also advantages to writing it like this. And so, as always, you need to decide by yourself and on a case-to-case basis. And with that being said, let's now move on to the next lecture and also implement the thunk. Next up, let's get our thunks back. So basically to get back the functionality of converting currencies. Now, in order to create thunks in Redux Toolkit, we can use the create async thunk function that Redux Toolkit provides us. However, using this function is, in my opinion, a lot of extra work when there is an easier solution, which is to simply use the action creator function that we already used before. So we can basically just reuse that function right here. And so let's do that. Now, if you are really interested in the create async thunk function, so basically in the Redux Toolkit way of doing things, we will use it in a future project. But for now, we will just do it in the easy way. So let's come here and copy this function right here. And paste it here. And this will then actually automatically work out of the box. And so that's because thunks are automatically provided in Redux Toolkit. So we don't have to install anything, and this will simply already work. So no setup required. The only thing that we need to do is to then no longer export this action creator that we automatically get. So remove that from here. And so again, for deposit, we now are going to use our own one. Just make sure that it has exactly the same name and that the type, so the action type, has exactly this shape. So again, that's the name of the slice and then slash the name of the reducer. So it's important that this follows this same convention. And with that, Redux is then smart enough to figure out that this is the action creator for that reducer. All right. And so all we have to do is to now also create a reducer for this converting currency. So let's copy that, paste that here. And then here actually all we need is the state. So this one doesn't depend on the action, and pay loan also doesn't. So it doesn't receive any payload. So here, all that's going to happen is state.loading will become true. And then in the end, basically after the deposit, state.isLoading will get back to false. And this should already be it. Now, for some reason, I keep getting this problem. So it's somehow related to the React developer tools. Maybe they don't play along nicely with Redux Toolkit. So let's try a hard reload this time. And okay, that actually works. All right, so let's just test that again to euros. And we have a problem. But I remember the reason for that problem, which is that here we changed our code. So we want to get this back, and let's even delete that one there. And so let's try that again. So 100 to euro. Let's reload, and probably getting that error again. Well, not this time. So 100 to euro. And there we go. Nice. So now we also implemented a thunk here in this Redux Toolkit logic. However, again, we did not really do it in the React Toolkit way, but this is actually completely fine as well. So here we did then not use the automatic action creator that has been created by create slice, but we used our own. All right. And again, later in the next project, we will then also look at that other way of doing the exact same thing. And now, just to finish, all we have to do is to also convert our customer slice. And so that will be the topic of our final video in this section. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do is to also convert our customer slice to Redux Toolkit. And actually, I want to leave this for you as a challenge. So if you'd like, you can pause the video now, and based on what we did earlier with the account slice, you can convert this code that we have here also into the Redux Toolkit way of doing things. So pause the video now, and once you're done, I will do the same. So just to see if we are doing it in the same way. Now, just before pausing, notice that here this create customer right now needs these two arguments. So it receives the full name and the national ID, which means that you will again need to prepare the payload just like we did in this one reducer right here. You also have to prepare the payload for the reducer, and so here you will have to do the same thing. So take a minute now, and then I meet you back here. All right. So let me now show you how it is done. So changing again the initial state name, and then let's get rid of this. And then of course React is gonna complain, but never mind, we will fix it soon. So let's import create slice, and so this is gonna be the customer slice, which is the result of create slice. Okay, so the name here is customer, then we need the initial state, and then we have our reducers. So the first one is again create customer, which is what we have here. And so for this one, we need to again prepare the data. So preparing the payload. And so here we need to not create a function or a method, but instead this object. And so in this object is where we will then place the methods. So first prepare. And so it is this prepare method which will actually receive the data that we pass into the action creator. Remember that? And so this is the one that receives the full name and the national ID. Now, by the way, so writing the method like this is exactly the same thing as writing this. So this is just a simplified way of writing methods in modern JavaScript. All right, and so remember that here we need to return the payload now. And so that payload is made out of the full name, the national ID, and then remember also the created at property, which we set to new date, and then to this ISO string. All right, and so this is again the kind of small side effect that you should not do inside the reducer, but instead right here in this prepare function. So in case you wanted to add this created at here, or maybe you also wanted, like, for example, to compute a random ID, then you should not do that in the reducer, but instead, then you should also create a prepare method like this. So even if this only takes, for example, one input, then you still would have to do this prepare function if you wanted to create a date or assign a random ID or something like that. All right, but anyway, now we can write our reducer, which gets the state, and then that payload that we just created here. So exactly this object. So this is what our reducer will now receive. And so now we can do what we did before, which is to then set all these properties. So the full name will become action.payload.fullName. State.nationalID will become action.payload.nationalID. And then the same thing for created at action.payload.created at. Now here we do not receive the payload, of course, but the action. So I said it wrong earlier, but maybe you caught that. So maybe you remembered that the reducer indeed gets access to the state and the action, but it is the payload that is on the action that is going to be equal to this. Okay, so that is one of the reducers, and the other one is for updating the name. So update name, and here it's an easier one because we don't have to prepare the data. So all that's going to happen is that state.fullName will become action.payload. And so now all we have to do is to export all of this. So create customer and update name. We will take from the customer slice dot actions. So this again will create the action creators, which we then destructure and export. And finally, we export default the customer slice dot reducer. And with this, our application should be back to working. Now here it says that this is undefined, and indeed it should be actions. Nice. So now that works, and let's see. Beautiful. And we can see again in our DevTools very nicely that indeed the correct action has been created. And so then we should also be able to dispatch manually again. So update name, and the payload should be test. And so that should work just like before, and beautiful. Okay, and this is it for this small application. So hopefully you had some fun learning Redux. So I really liked this section actually. So I think it was a lot of fun working through this code, really starting from the very beginning. So especially here with these initial stores before Redux Toolkit, and then really seeing how all the pieces fit together in the end. So hopefully all of that made sense and clicked for you, so that now you feel confident in using Redux if you want to or if you have to. Now, I just saw one final thing, which is the title here that we haven't changed yet. So let's just copy this and also place it in the title of the index.html file, because that will give us a bit of a surprising result, which is that then in the Redux DevTools, we get the title right here. So this is helpful if we have multiple tabs open, and when all of them use Redux, we can simply switch between them right here. So this DevTools here is basically the same tool for all of the pages or all the tabs that are currently open. But anyway, with this, we really now finished this section, and all we have to do is to now compare Redux with the context API that we have already learned before earlier. So those are two things that people like to compare a lot, and so that's why in the next video we will do that together. Okay, and now to finish this section, we're back to another one of these lectures that compares two things, and this time comparing Redux with React's Context API. So, as I have mentioned in an earlier video, many people started seeing the Context API, especially when coupled with useReducer, as a complete replacement for Redux. And while this can certainly be true in some situations, let's not simply follow these trends, but instead have a more nuanced and fact-based discussion here. So, in this video, I want to summarize what we have learned about both these solutions to manage global state by taking a look at their pros and cons, and ultimately giving you recommendations on when to use context and when to use Redux. So the first advantage of the context plus useReducer solution is that these features are already built into React, while if you want to use Redux, you need to install additional packages, which is not only more work, but will also increase your bundle size. Now, in terms of setup, it's quite straightforward to set up a single context and useReducer, pass the state value into the context, and then provide it to the app. However, for each additional state slice, you will need to do the same thing again. So you will need to set up everything from scratch for each new piece of state, or each new slice of state. And this can lead to something that we call provider hell, where you end up with many context providers in your main app component. On the other hand, Redux requires a bit more work to do the initial setup, but once that is done, it's quite straightforward to add additional state slices. All you need to do is to create a new slice file and add your reducers, but you don't need to create another provider and another custom hook. Now, when it comes to async operations like fetching data, the Context API has no built-in mechanism for that, as we have experienced ourselves in the WorldWise application. Redux, on the other hand, has support for middleware. And while middleware is not necessarily easy to use, it does give us a way to handle asynchronous tasks right inside the state management tool. Just keep in mind that we should probably not use any of these tools for remote state anyway. But sometimes it can still be useful to be able to fetch just some single data point from an API. So just like we did with the currency conversion in this section, right? Now, moving on, as we saw in the previous section, optimizing the performance of the Context API and useReducer solution can require some work, while Redux comes with many optimizations out of the box, so including minimizing wasted renders. And now finally, to finish our list of pros and cons, let's consider that Redux has some excellent dev tools, while for the Context API, we can only use the simple React developer tools. And this can make a huge difference in applications where the state is truly huge and complex and is updated a lot. So from this list, it appears that Redux has way more pros than the Context API, but that's not really the point here. So we're not counting the pros and cons. I'm just giving you the facts. But now, based on these facts, let's move on to some actual usage recommendations. So the general consensus seems to be use the Context API plus React hooks for global state management in small applications, and use Redux to manage global state in large apps. But that's not super helpful, and so let's dig a bit deeper. Just know that, in general, there is never a right answer that is going to fit every single project out there. So the technical choice between any of these solutions will always depend entirely on the project's needs. But with that being said, when, for example, all you need is to share a value that doesn't change very often, then the Context API is perfect for that. And some examples are the app color theme, the user's preferred language, or the currently authenticated user. So these will rarely change, and so you can use a context for those, because there will be no need to optimize the context in this situation. Now, on the other hand, when you do have lots of UI state that needs frequent updates, like a shopping cart, the currently open tabs, or some complex data filters, then Redux might be the way to go. And this is because, as we just learned, Redux is already heavily optimized for these frequent updates. As we also already touched on, Redux is perfect when you have complex state with nested objects, because then you can mutate state in Redux Toolkit, which is really helpful. So these are the two situations in which I would personally reach for Redux. Now, they are not that common when it comes to UI state, and so again, this is why Redux has fallen a bit out of favor recently. Now, going back to the Context API, it can be very helpful when we have a simple prop drilling problem that we need to solve, or when we need to manage some state in a local subtree of the application. So in that case, it's not really global state, but state that is global to a smaller subpart of the app, basically. And one important use case of this is the advanced compound component pattern that we're gonna study later. Okay, so again, you need to choose what's best for your particular project and not simply follow some trend that you read about online. And that's true for every technological choice that you're gonna make. But this whole context versus Redux thing is a big debate that's been going on for some time in the React community, which is why I felt that I had to make this video about it. But anyway, with this, we have just finished yet another section. So I hope that you feel confident with Redux now, and to see you back here very soon.